At the time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones, I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction, even of their simple meaning, was not very correct, for I read "wife of the above" as a complimentary reference to my father's exhalation to a better world, and if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I've no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance that I suppose my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house on one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down the wheelwrights or up by the mill. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity, I was not to be what Miss Joe called pompied, or, as I render it, pampered. Therefore, I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbor happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds or pick up stones, or do any such job, I was favored with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on the kitchen mantel shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually towards the liquidation of the national debt, but I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. Mr. Wopsle's great aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in the society of youth, who paid 2 pence per week each, for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She rented a small cottage, and Mr. Wopsle had the room upstairs, where we students used to overhear him reading aloud in a most dignified and terrific manner, and occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There is a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once in a quarter. What he did on those occasions was to turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, and give us Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. That this was always followed by Collins's Ode on the Passions, wherein I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as revenge, throwing his blood-stained sword in thunder down, and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, and as it was in later life, when I fell into society of the passions, and compared them with Collins and Wopsle rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had, or what the price of anything in it was, but there was very little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices. And by this oracle, Biddy arranged all the shop transaction. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's granddaughter. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem what relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan like myself, like me too, had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect of her extremities, for her hair always wanted brushing, her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at heel. This description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays she went to church elaborated. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that I fell amongst those thieves, the 9 letters who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began in a purblind, groping way to read, write, and cipher on the very smallest scale. One night I was sitting in the chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marches, for it was a long time after, and it was winter and a hard frost. With an alphabet on the hearth at my feet for reference, I contrived in an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. Me dear Jew, opie you are here quite well. Opie I shall soon be able to tending goin on, then we shall be so glad, and when I am pretending you, Joe Watt Larks, and believe me, Imph Exen Pip. There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me and we were alone, but I delivered this written communication, slate and all, with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. "I say, Pip, old chap," cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide, "what a scholar you are, ain't you?" "I should like to be," said I, glancing at the slate as he held it, with the misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. "Why, here's a J," said Joe, "and an O equal to anything. Here's a J and an O, Pip, and a J-O, Joe." I had never heard Joe read aloud to any greater extent than this municipal, and I had observed at church last Sunday when I accidentally held our prayer book upside down, that it seemed to suit his convenience quite as well as if it had been all right. Wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, but read the rest, Joe." "The rest, Pip?" said Joe, looking at it with a close, slowly searching eye. 1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's, and 3 O's, and 3 J-O's. Joe's in it, Pip." I leaned over Joe, and with the aid of my forefinger, read him the whole letter. "Astonishing," said Joe when I had finished. "You are a scholar." "How do you spell Gargery, Joe?" I asked him with a modest patronage. "I don't spell it at all," said Joe, "but supposing you did." "It can't be supposed," said Joe, "though I'm uncommon fond of reading too. Are you, Joe?" "Uncommon give me," said Joe, "a good book or a good newspaper, and sit me down afore a good fire, and I ask no better, Lord," he continued after rubbing his knees a little, "when you do come to a J and an O, and says he, 'Here at last it is a J-O, Joe.' How's interesting reading, sir." I derived from this last that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, I inquired, "Didn't you ever go back to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "No, Pip. Why didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "Well, Pip," said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself to his usual occupation when he was thoughtful, of slowly racking the fire between the lower bars, "I'll tell you. My father, Pip, he were given to drink, and when we were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother most unmercifully. If it were the most hammering he did, indeed, excepting at myself, and he hammered at me with a vigor only to be equaled with the vigor with which he didn't hammer at his anvil. Here, you're a listening and understanding, Pip." "Yes, Joe." "Consequence, my mother and me, we ran away from my father several times, and then my mother, she'd go out to work, and she'd say, 'Joe,' she'd say, 'now, please God, you shall have some schooling, child,' and she'd put me into school. But my father were that good in his heart that he couldn't abear to be without us, so he'd come with the most tremendous crowd, and make such a row at the doors of the house where we was, that they used to be obligated to have no more to do with us, and to give us up to him, and then he took us home and hammered us. Which, you see, Pip," said Joe, pausing in his meditative raking of the fire and looking at me, "were a drawback on my learning." "Certainly, poor Joe. Though mind you, Pip," said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, "rendering unto all their due, and maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see?" "I don't see, but I didn't say so." "Well," Joe pursued, somebody must keep the pot of billing, Pip, or the pot won't bile, don't you know? I say that, and said so. Consequence, my father didn't have objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too. If he had followed it, and I worked tolerably hard, I assure you, Pip. In time I were able to keep him, and I kept him till we went off in a purple leptic fit, and it was my intentions to have had put up upon his tombstone that whatsoever the fallings of his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart. Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. "I made it," said Joe, "my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe, complete in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own Ed. To tell you the truth, hardly believed it were my own Ed. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have had it cut over him, but poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, small or large, and it were not done. Not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She was in poor health and quite broke. She weren't long of following, poor soul, and her share of peace come round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. He rubbed first one of them and then the other in a most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner with the round knob on the top of the poker. It were but lonesome then, said Joe, living here alone, and I got acquitted with your sister now, Pip. Joe looked firmly at me, as if he knew I were not going to argue with him. Your sister is a fine figure of a woman. I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. Whatever family opinions or whatever the world's opinions on that subject might be, Pip, your sister is. Joe tapped the top bar with the poker after every word following. A fine figure of a woman. I could think of nothing better to say than, I'm glad you think so, Joe. So am I, returned Joe, catching me up. I'm glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone here or there, what does it matter signify to me? I sagaciously observed, if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? Certainly, assented Joe. That's it. You're right, old chap. When I got acquitted with your sister, it were the talk how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her too, all the folks said, and I said along with all the folks. As to you, Joe pursued with a conscious expression of seeing something very nasty indeed. If you could have been aware how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself. Not exactly relishing this, I said. Never mind me, Joe. But I did mind you, Pip. He returned with tender simplicity. When I offered to your sister to keep company and to be asked in church at such times as she was willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, and bring the poor little child. God bless the poor little child, I said to your sister. There's room for him at the forge. I broke out crying and begging pardon, and hugged Joe round the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me and to say, ever the best of friends, ain't us, Pip? Don't cry, old chap. When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed, well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. Now, when you take me in the hand, in my learning, Pip, and I tell you beforehand, I am awful dull, most awful dull. Miss Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, as I may say, on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip. He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. Your sister is given to government. Given to government, Joe? I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea, and I am afraid I must add hope, that Joe had divorced her in a favor of the Lords of the Admiralty or Treasurer. Given to government, said Joe, which I mean to say the government of you and myself. Oh, and she ain't over partial to have scholars on the premises, Joe continued, and in particular would not be over partial to me being a scholar, for fear as I might rise like a sort of rebel, don't you see? I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as to say why, when Joe stopped me. Stay a bit. I know what you are going to say, Pip. Stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes the mogul over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us backfalls, and that she do drop down upon us heavy. At such times as when your sister is on the rampage, Pip. Joe sunk his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. Candor compels Fur to admit that she is a buster. Joe pronounced the word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off, Pip. Yes, Joe. Well, said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation. Your sister's a mastermind. A mastermind. What's that? I asked, in some hope of bringing him to a stand, but Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circuitously and answering with a fixed look, her. And I ain't a mastermind, said Joe, when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. And last of all, Pip, and this I want to say very serious to you, old chap, I see so much in my poor mother of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart and never getting no peace in her mortal days, that I'm dead afraid of going wrong in the way of not doing what's right by a woman, and I'd prefer rather of the two go wrong the two other way, and be a little ill-convenienced myself. I wish it was only me that got put up out, Pip. I wish there weren't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself. But this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip, and I hope you'll overlook shortcomings. Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equal afterwards, as we had been before, but afterwards, at quiet times, when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in his heart. However, said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, here's the Dutch clock a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of them, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare hadn't have set a 4 foot on a piece of ice and gone down. Miss Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment. Uncle Pumblechook being a bachelor and reposing no confidence in his domestic servant. This was a market day, and Miss Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out in the marshes, I thought, and then I looked at the stairs and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. Here comes the mare, said Joe, ringing like a peal of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out, ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that she might see a bright window and took a final survey of the kitchen that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up, wrapped to the eyes. Miss Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblechook was soon down too, covering the air with a cloth, and we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive all the heat of the fire. Now, said Miss Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders where it hung by the strings, if this boy ain't grateful this night, he never will be. I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could, who is wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. It's only to be hoped, said my sister, that he won't be pompied, but I have my fears. She ain't in that line, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. She knows better. She, I looked at Joe making the motion with her lips and eyebrows. Joe looked at me making the motion with his lips and eyebrows. My sister catching him in the act, he drew the back of his hands across his nose with such unusual conciliatory air on such occasions and looked at her. Well, said my sister in her snappish way, what are you staring at? Is the house afire? Which some individual, Joe politely hintily, mentioned she. And she is a she, I suppose, said my sister, unless you call Miss Havisham a he, and I doubt if even you'll go so far as that. Miss Havisham uptown, said Joe. Is there any Miss Havisham downtown? Returned my sister. She wants this boy to go and play there, and of course he's going, and he had better play there, said my sister, shaking her head at me as an encouragement to be extremely light and sportive, or I'll work him. I had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. Everybody from miles around had heard of Miss Havisham uptown as an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house barricaded against robbers, and who had led a life of seclusion. Well, to be sure, said Joe. I wonder how she come to know Pip. Noodle, cried my sister. Who said she knew him? Which some individual, Joe again politely hinted, mentioned that she wanted him to go and play there. And couldn't she ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? Isn't it quite possible that Uncle Pumblechook may be a tenant of hers, and that he may have something? We won't say quarterly or half-yearly, for that would be requiring too much of you, but sometimes go there to pay his rent? And couldn't she then ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? And couldn't Uncle Pumblechook, being always considerate and thoughtful for us, though he may not think it, Joseph, in a tone of the deepest reproach, as if he were the most careless of nephews, then mentioned this boy standing prancing here, which I solemnly declare I was not doing, that I have forever been a willing slave to. Good again, cried Uncle Pumblechook. Well put. Prettily pointed. Good indeed. Now, Joseph, you know the case. No, Joseph, said my sister, still in a reproachful manner, while Joe apologetically drew the back of his hand across his nose. You do not know yet, though you may not think it, know the case. You may consider that you do, but you do not, Joseph, for you do not know that Uncle Pumblechook, being sensible that for anything we can tell him, this boy's fortune may be made by going to Miss Havisham's, has offered to take him into town tonight in his own chaise cart, and to keep him tonight, and to take him with his own hands to Miss Havisham tomorrow morning. And Laura Musimi, cried my sister, casting off her bonnet in sudden desperation, here I stand talking to mere Monclaves, with Uncle Pumblechook waiting, and the more catching cold at the door, while here I stand talking to, and the boy grimed with croak and dirt from the head of his hair to the sole of his foot. With that, she pounced upon me like an eagle on a lamb, and my face was squeezed into wooden bowls and sinks, and my head was put under taps of water butts, and I was soaped and kneaded and towelled and thumped and harrowed and rasped until I was quite beside myself. I may here remark that I suppose myself to be better acquainted than any living authority with the rigid effect of a wedding ring passing sympathetically over the human countenance. Here, when my ablutions were completed, I was put into clean linen of the stiffest character, like a young penitent into sackcloth, and was trussed up in my tightest and fearfulest suit. I was then delivered over to Mr. Pumblechook, who formally received me as if he were the sheriff, and who let off upon me the speech that I knew had been dying to make all day. Boy, be ever grateful to all friends, and especially unto them which brought you up by hand. Goodbye, Joe. Goodbye, Pip, old chap. I had never parted from him before, and what with my feelings, and what with soap suds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart, but they twinkled out one by one, without throwing any light on the questions why on earth I was going to play at Miss Havisham's, and what on earth I was expected to play at